This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, November 1894, U.S. troops came to the village of Orive in northeastern Arizona and arrested 19 Hopi men. They took them first to Fort Defiance and then onto a prison on the island of Alcatraz, a rocky outpost in the San Francisco Bay. This was the culmination of sorts of a year or more of resistance by this Hopi Indian community, resistance to attempts to quote-unquote Americanize them by the U.S. government. The centerpiece of this story was the schooling of Hopi children, but of course, part of this program was also seizing of land and resources. We'll get into this, but the Hopi resisted in a really interesting and often very successful ways, at least for a few years in the mid-1890s. But then we do get to this moment, 19 men arrested, taken to Alcatraz, where they spent nearly a year. Let's get into the conversation, but I just want to read a little bit from a San Francisco newspaper reflecting how this story was reported on, at least in the white press. Writing of the prisoners, the San Francisco Call newspaper said, quote, "They have not hardship aside from the fact that they have been rudely snatched from the bosom of their families." So that's a real, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play
how
situation?
Rude. Yeah.
And it goes on to say, "They are prisoners, and prisoners they shall stay until they have learned to appreciate the advantage of education," presumably their Western Americanized education. But let's talk about the Hopi prisoners on Alcatraz Island in 1894. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Want to paint that picture of the kind of push towards quote-unquote Americanization of not just the Hopi, but many Native communities in the West in the late 1800s into the 20th century. And I mentioned schooling as being a real big part of that.
So historically, Native American children in particular have been targeted and really forced into these boarding schools, these Western schools, as you called it, to get them to assimilate. They were told not to speak their language. They were forced to have their hair cut. They were forced to wear like traditional American clothing. And many times they were taken far away from their family. So that was no other way that their parents or family members could come visit. And so there was huge resistance around this. As you can imagine, most parents would not want their children taken far away from them or taken at all, and certainly into school that they didn't understand what was happening, and that they felt like was going to strip their children of their identity and their heritage. And this went on for a really, really long time. And those schools weren't just about assimilation. A lot of them were violent and abusive places to be. And this went on for decades.
And this was part of a much broader attempt at, quote unquote, assimilation of Native Americans. And the idea behind it was basically a advanced stage of ethnic cleansing. You know, in the early days of first British and then U.S. occupation of the land, there was a kind of admiration for Native cultures. This idea, if, you know, a little patronizing, that these sort of noble savage idea, that there was something to learn from these cultures. But by the time that the U.S. had gobbled up most of this indigenous land, now they had a different problem, was they didn't really have anywhere else to move indigenous people. And so now it was about breaking down the rest of their culture. And so part of this is forcing Native Americans onto allotments to force them into a farming rather than a nomadic lifestyle, you know, depending on what tribe you're part of. You might already be a part of an agricultural lifestyle, but the idea was that you have individual plots of land that you're farming in an American way, that your children are being educated in these English schools, in order to, again, just like break down the remaining indigenous cultures, and to absorb what's left of these tribes.
I mentioned that there was a real kind of active resistance to this. It's kind of remarkable. Do you have thoughts on what exactly that looked like, maybe with the schooling, but then also with the kind of other stuff we mentioned about sort of seizing of land or seizing of farms.
I mean, when it came to the schooling, it's funny. Parents initially refused. And then they did something which I think is really passive. They would say, sure, fine. And then they would never send them. And so there was this idea that, we're not going to go along. We're not going to comply. And we will give lip service if that's what you want. But no one was really interested in having their children be far away from them. And so one of the interventions was we take the school and we put it right where they are. We put it right there in the village. And even then, parents still refuse to send their children to the local school.
There was also this way of what do they call it? Pernicious compliance or something like that, where they were like, oh, you want us to plant? Yeah, we're going to go plant on the land that is actually ours and not the land that the government has designated as ours. Mm-hmm. And so even in this act of planting a field, they're demonstrating a kind of resistance. And I think it's worth also saying that this is all happening, right? We're talking about 1894. We've talked about the ghost dance movement, I think, in a previous episode, and that was happening in 1890. So this is happening kind of all in various parts of the country, but it's the Hopis that are resisting this particular way of resisting the schools and resisting the plantings.
Yeah. So let's then go to this moment where it's funny. I mean, Kellie, you're pointing out this like interesting dynamic of, sure, we'll do this, but then you don't actually go along with it, which then puts the burden on the government to like actually run the logistics of this. And I'm struck by the fact that like the government doesn't have that capacity. Their next move is not that. Their next move is armed violence. It's like oh shoot, now we have to actually set these schools up. Actually, might be easier to just send in the troops, right? And sending in the troops often feels like the simpler answer. And so that's what happens here. And they come in and they go after, the men in the community, not the women. They don't take the children away, but they actually go after a group of 19 men.
Because they see the men as the leaders in the community and the ones that they see are sort of like the spearheading this movement of refusal. And so they think that if they can get rid of these men, these leaders, that the rest of the community will comply.
And they had tried other things. Like they had already taken more than 100 children. They had tried kind of starving out the Hopi in hopes that would get them to comply. And the fact that they had resisted thus far, right. It seemed like they were trying to kind of break the back of the resistance by removing these men from the community by throwing them in jail.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
So, part of the story for me that's interesting is I didn't really have a sense that Alcatraz was kind of played this role that far back,
Same.
During westward expansion, it had already kind of become a prison of sorts. So I was really struck by, I guess I knew there was a fort there, but yeah, it was a prison even in that moment, and that's where these 19 Hopi men end up. You want to talk about what happens when they get on that prison and how long they're there for? It was just under a year or so. How are they treated, and how do they finally get off Alcatraz?
Well, as you pointed out, Jody, how they were treated and how the press said they were treated are two very different things. It actually reminds me so much of press coverage of Japanese internment, right? Yeah. Oh, they're just having like happy little learning experiences and they get to spend their days doing what they like and enjoying themselves, which is not actually how they experienced imprisonment. First of all, it is imprisonment. You've been taken away from your community. Yeah. You've been put out on this island in what is a damp and dank space. You're in these small cells. It was awful in the way that 19th century imprisonment is awful. The way 21st century imprisonment is awful, right? It's deeply disruptive and deeply destructive in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it's not just the fact that they're incarcerated, but they are incarcerated hundreds of miles away from all of their loved ones, from Arizona all the way to the coast of San Francisco. So, this is not a place in which their loved ones can sort of visit them or be with them. And yeah, I think this is, the story of how we understand Native Americans in this country, and how it goes so quickly to push to either assimilate or be criminalized, or actually both, is kind of what is happening in this situation.
To that point, Kellie, about kind of being torn from families and being separated, I mean, there's just this really interesting component here of both information and propaganda, and you have kind of newspapers saying, oh, they're being well treated and they're well fed, and then you have these photos that get out and they get back to their families back home, and no one, people don't look like they're in very good shape, and so it is this interesting spinning. And I do want to kind of give a shout out to a character who I don't know if we've talked about on the show that much, but Charles Fletcher Loomis, who maybe it's Lummis, who was a early kind of, I don't know, maybe like the Upton Sinclair of the West or something, but sort of a journalist and an activist who wrote a lot about Native American causes. He then went on to kind of, he was one of the founders of the Los Angeles Times, but he wrote in real time pretty forcefully about the treatment of the Hopi in this moment. And I think it's worth pointing out that there were people who were, telling the other story, that the government was not. Do you, as we wrap up, have a sense of how this sort of concludes? I mean, I'm struck by, when you read about this story, a lot of the official materials kind of end with we don't really know that much about this story. And if you have other information, or if stories have been passed on in your family, please reach out to us, But we know that kind of by August, the following summer, these 19 Hopi men who had been there for seditious conduct are off the island, but I don't really have a sense of what exactly, quote unquote, frees them, or what exactly happens to them.
I mean, that's kind of the violence of the whole story, right? It's this erasure, that you don't know what happens to these men. And you know that the Hopi people are ultimately forced to move, that children are ultimately taken away. I mean, this is a story of not just loss, but like a either erasure or amnesia of that loss as well, which I think is doubly painful. Not just that the story exists, but that the difficulty in telling the stories, that so many parts of it are missing.
Yeah.
You can certainly read into it that the U.S. government felt that it had neutralized the threat. It had continued apace with the program of taking these children away while the men were away, and there isn't a big fight or conflagration that happens afterward. It's just I don't want to treat these communities as though they were completely destroyed and don't still exist, but the policy went forward.
All right. Well, we will end it there, other than to say, as I was reading this, both obviously this moment of Native American resistance and this connection to Alcatraz, I was reminded of that episode we did, maybe in the first year of this show, about in the 1970s, a group of Native American activists who seized Alcatraz. And we had that great guest, Julian Brave Noise Cat, who walked us through that story. It was really amazing story. And those activists in the 70s who seized Alcatraz knew this history and so forth. So I think I'm deciding in real time here, but I think we're going to rerun that episode next, because I just think they'll pair nicely, and people probably haven't heard that in a while if they've heard it at all. So we'll run that next as a kind of another chapter in this interesting story about Alcatraz and Native resistance, and then we'll keep going. We'll keep going after that. There's more history to be done. But anyway, that was a really fascinating episode, as was this. All right, we are at the end of the episode, but as we wrap up the show, let's do our usual Also on This Day section where we read a few things that happened also on this day throughout history. And as you may know, during the fundraiser, we've been inviting some fellow Radiotopia hosts to join us and send in a recording of Also on This Days. So here is Dom French from the Adultish podcast bringing us today's list of events. And also, I totally messed up the calendar and told Don to record some for November 26th instead of November 28th, which is the day of this episode. I know even I make mistakes from time to time, but Don did a great job. So here we go. Take a listen.
Hey y'all, it's Dom from the Radiotopia show Adultish, bringing you this episode's Also on This Day. So here we go. Also on November 26th, 1863, good old Abraham Lincoln proclaimed that November 26th would be National Thanksgiving Day to be celebrated annually on the final Thursday of November. Gobble, gobble to you, Abraham Lincoln. And on this day in 1947, the Hollywood 10 are blacklisted from the movie studios. Oh, come see me about it sometime. And on this day in 2000, George W. Bush is certified the winner of Florida's electoral votes. Womp womp. Thanks, y'all. This has been Dominique French from the Radiotopia show Adultish. And I hope you enjoy this day in esoteric history.
All right, there you have it. Dom French from the excellent Radiotopia show Adultish. And we haven't done episodes on any of those, though we did do an episode about the date of Thanksgiving getting moved during World War II, which is really fascinating. You can go track that down if you still want to get some Thanksgiving content. But thanks again to Dom. And yeah, Radiotopia, it's got a ton of fantastic shows. The best independent podcast producers around make their home here, and we can only do it with your support. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It is the fundraiser. Do what you can. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the episode. As always, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia from PRX.